What if a horror story didn't come from monsters or ghosts, but from human experiments the government actually tried? That's what Intercepts by TJ Payne will have you thinking about. It's a story built around sensory deprivation, psychic abilities, and mind control. And while that sounds like pure fiction, the real world has already gotten uncomfortably close. Hello, I'm Jay if you're new here, and welcome. Today I'm doing an in-depth review on Intercepts by TJ Payne, which I read in the spooky season in order to scare myself, because why not? The book opens not with the people running the experiment, but with one of their victims, a test subject who's been trapped in absolute silence for years. In that darkness, they've learned to tune into faint sounds from the outside world, piecing together fragments of conversation. It's both horrifying and strangely believable, a mind adapting in ways it was never meant to. They hear a name, Joe Gerhard. They don't know who he is, only that he's connected to what's being done to them. They make a quiet promise to destroy everything tied to him. And that's all just in the prologue. So then we jump to present day. Joe Gerhard turns out to be the supervisor at a secret government facility buried somewhere in the hills of West Virginia. He's not a mad scientist. He's just a regular guy doing his job, managing staff, keeping the company happy. He has no idea that his name is echoing around in the mind of someone locked in one of the cells below him. Things begin to unravel fast. An orderly is mauled to death by one of the subjects, called Antennas, and Joe's ex-wife dies suddenly. And his daughter begins seeing a woman in a hospital gown who seems to know things she shouldn't. At first, this feels like classic horror. Isolation, grief, science gone too far. But beneath that is something more cerebral, a story about psychological exposure. The real danger? It's that Joe's thoughts might not be his own anymore. And that's what makes this one feel so close to reality, because experiments like this aren't just a horror trope. In the mid-20th century, the US government actually conducted programs exploring mind manipulation and psychic perception. MK Ultra tested drugs and sensory deprivation to alter behavior, and another, the Stargate Project, focused on remote viewing, training people to describe distant locations using only their minds. This is so fascinating to me. There are a lot of videos available if you want to go down a dark hole like I did on this one. Anyway, both were real, both were classified for decades, and both show just how easily science can cross into something sinister. So yes, Intercepts is fiction, but it's fiction with roots. So I enjoyed reading this book. It's fast-paced, cinematic, and filled with tension. The scenes with Bishop, the subject who seems to psychically connect with Joe and his daughter, are especially strong. They have that controlled chaos feeling you get in good sci-fi horror. But here's the thing. For the most part, I wasn't scared. The tension was there, the gore was there, but the fear wasn't. It almost touches on the scariest concept it has. The mind as a signal that can be tuned, intercepted, and altered. But then it shifts gears into something more like an action thriller. Facility lockdowns, corporate cover-ups, the nerve gas systems, and that's where the "this could happen" question starts to fade. The more the book explains the science, the less room there is for us to doubt, to imagine, to fill in the unknown. I kept waiting for it to make me question what was real, to have that moment where I thought, maybe none of this is actually happening. Maybe it's all in Joe's mind. In teeny tiny spoiler, we get the tiniest taste of that doubt. And a larger, more general spoiler, by the end of the book, it just confirms everything outright. The fear becomes external instead of internal, and the story loses a little bit of its mystery. What would have made it truly terrifying for me is if Payne had leaned in deeper to the uncertainty, into the horror of not knowing whether your thoughts belong to you. Imagine if we'd been left wondering whether Bishop was controlling Joe, or whether he'd already been one of the experiments all along, if his daughter's visions were real, or were they projections of guilt? That's the kind of psychological unease that lingers, the what if my brain is lying to me kind of fear. It's also the one that ties back into those real experiments, because the line between scientific research and psychological interference has always been thinner than people want to admit. Even though Intercepts doesn't quite push that far, the concept is so strong that it does keep you thinking long after the final page. The more I sat with it, the less I wanted Intercepts to simply scare me, and the more I wanted it to make me wonder. Because the strange thing is, the human mind really is mysterious. The CIA's Stargate project, this Cold War program that explored remote viewing, ran for almost 2 decades before it was declassified. Most scientists who have reviewed it since say the evidence wasn't strong, but even then, a few results were odd enough to keep people curious. And that's what fascinates me, is how the mind can be both fragile and unpredictable. Yet we're also capable of imagination so vivid it almost crosses into perception. If Intercepts had leaned harder into that, the idea that maybe the story wasn't pure fiction, that maybe the mind really is that porous, it could have been less about horror through violence and more about horror through wonder. The kind that leaves you sitting in the dark afterward, thinking, what if my thoughts aren't as private as I believe? Or even scarier, what if my thoughts aren't my own? Still, this book works in a lot of ways. The pacing is tight, the premise is fascinating, and that ending, okay, I can't spoil it. I was going to, but I can't. It's bleak in a satisfying way. It's not a story about defeating evil. It's about being consumed by it. And even if it didn't terrify me, it reminded me that the best horror doesn't always come from what we see, but from what we suspect. The project in Intercepts is described as almost perfected, and honestly, it feels like the perfect metaphor for the novel itself. It's almost a masterpiece of psychological horror, almost the kind of story that makes you look at your own mind differently. But even if it doesn't go all the way, the seed of that idea that someone or something could tamper with your perception is haunting enough. And when you remember that versions of these experiments actually happened, it's hard not to wonder what's still happening quietly today. So could this really happen? Maybe not exactly like Intercepts, but human curiosity has always been willing to cross the line between discovery and danger. And that's what makes stories like this so unnerving. They remind us of how thin that line really is. If you like fast-paced horror with a science lab edge, Intercepts is definitely worth checking out. Just don't expect to lose sleep from jump scares, although there were a couple, but you may lose sleep from overthinking what your own brain might be capable of. And if you've read this one, or if you had a book that did actually scare you, please drop it in the comments. If I haven't read it already, I will probably end up picking it up. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you're doing well and that you're enjoying the fall season. I'll see you again soon in the next video. Bye!